Welcome back to my classroom with the fireplace going, trying to get all nice and warm here. If George Washington had not commanded the Revolutionary War Continental Army, the war would have been over before it even started. That's how impressive he was. He was a Virginian, born and raised in Virginia. His father is not known about, it's never talked about. He was raised by his mother, raised by his uncle, and his older brother, who were all three were very influential on him. George Washington had no formal education beyond grade school. Everything he learned on the job. He wanted to join the Navy, the British Navy. That wasn't his way. So he ended up joining the Virginia militia and would later serve in that militia and also in the British Army during the French and Indian War, which was in 1754. Growing up, he went off to learn to be a surveyor in what is now the Ohio Territory, and that's would prove again to be very helpful in his military days. Another thing that was fun, I thought, would point out that when Alex and I would go sailing, when we lived on our sailboat and went south for the winters, we went through the Great Dismal Swamp Canal. And you never guess who surveyed that in about 1763? George Washington. Part of his surveying crew was there, he was there, and it's in a marvelous, marvelous place. So anyway, George Washington went over to the Ohio Territory and surveyed, learned, made friends, learned the language of the Native Americans there. And during the War of 1754, it was the British against the French over the Ohio Territory, and it was Washington's in-depth knowledge of that area that allowed the British to prevail and earned him a commission in the British Army. Once the war was over, he resigned, went back to work on his plantation in Virginia. He was appointed as a delegate to the Continental Congress in 1775. And he went to Philadelphia where the Congress was being held, and he knew there was going to be a war, and he wanted to lead that war. He was very good at soldiering. And so he went as a delegate from Virginia, and every day he showed up in his uniform. And it was pretty impressive. And George Washington was 6 feet tall, which was a good foot taller than the average man back in the day. And so he had this very impressive stature. His back was straight. He was a formidable figure. And although he wasn't really the choice of the northern colonies to lead the Continental Army, because they all wanted a guy by the name of Joseph Warren, we'll talk about him later, they realized that they had to incorporate somebody from the South. They needed to get the South on board. We talked yesterday about how the southern colonies weren't overly enthused about going to war against Britain. So John Adams and Ben Franklin and some others got together and they asked George Washington if he would be the commander-in-chief. He agreed, and he was selected as commander-in-chief. And in June 1775, he got on his horse and rode to Boston and assumed control of the motley crew that was known as the Continental Army. It was militia from all over. They were rebel rousers. They drank. They did everything but soldier, and he taught them how to be soldiers. So we could talk about George Washington forever, but anyway, because he was so involved, but his greatest strengths were he knew how to motivate men. Now, which was very important because the men had no motivation to do anything. They had enlistments that were going to end soon. They came to fight and they weren't fighting. There was no fighting going on. And so he had to motivate them somehow. And to give you an example of his ability to motivate people, imagine, if you will, in the middle of winter, December, in New Jersey, you're camped out and you need to motivate your men. And the best way to do that with people that like to fight is to get them into a battle. So George says, let's go, and we're going to attack Trenton. Now the snow is 2 feet deep. These men don't have shoes. They have no clothing, poor equipment, and he gets them up on Christmas Day, and they march to Trenton, New Jersey, over the Delaware River, which is frozen, and they march down there and they have a routing victory. And the victory then convinces people that they can win, and a lot of them re-enlist, and he saves his army. If he hadn't done that, if he hadn't motivated his men to march without shoes, we would have lost the war. The war would have ended at that point. He motivated his men. I have my helper here. So he motivated his men at the Battle of New York. He motivated his men during the winter of 79 and 80 at Monmouth in New Jersey. And we'll talk all about this. And he was a man that liked to motivate by example. And he used his example. He was always in the front. It was terrifying for his aides because George wanted to be in the front. And that's how he motivated his people. He showed them, this is the way to do it. Follow me. He was one of those follow me people, much like his friend Benedict Arnold was another follow me leader. And we'll talk about Benedict in sessions that will come up later on. But anyway, so that's George in a nutshell. For all of you that think George cut down a cherry tree, no, didn't happen. George never cut down a cherry tree. George didn't have wooden teeth either. That's a myth as well. George did have false teeth, though, and he had teeth from other people. They were extracted when they passed away and made into dentures. And the dentures were a sore spot in George for years and years and years, and he complained about them profusely. So if you want to read about George, here's two great books. One by Nathaniel Philbrick, who is a wonderful writer, and I love all his books. And the other is by Joseph Ellis. They're both on George Washington. They're fabulous. It's part of my collection, and I would highly recommend that you pick them up and read them. And if you have any questions, again, please drop me a line on Facebook, and we'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow is a battle.